So if you remember from the last video, bryophytes were non-vascular plants and could not get very large or have roots because they rely on diffusion to move water to their tissues. However, the vascular plants have evolved a circulatory system for transporting water and nutrients that lets them get larger and live in drier environments than the bryophytes. Here's what this circulatory system looks like. It's a series of tubes through which water can move, carrying nutrients. There are two types of tubes in the plant vascular system, xylem and phloem. Xylem carries water and nutrients from the root system to the shoot system. Phloem goes in the opposite direction, carrying the sugars produced by photosynthesis in the leaves to the rest of the plant and the roots. Now pause the video to answer this question. Vascular plants have many different strategies for reproducing. Some of the more primitive vascular plants, like ferns, have systems similar to bryophytes that still rely on water. Like bryophytes, the sperm still need to swim through water to reach the egg and form spores. This is why you usually only see ferns living in moist areas. But unlike bryophytes, they can get a little taller because they have this vascular system. And this means they can also use wind to spread their spores. The seed was also an important adaptation to life on land. A seed is not only a plant embryo, it also has its own store of water and nutrients to get that new plant started, and it's encased in a protective coating. This store of water and nutrients is known as the endosperm. The endosperm allows a plant embryo to germinate even if it lands somewhere where there is not much water or nutrients. It provides the germinating seedling everything it needs to start growing until it can develop roots and shoots to start gathering water, sunlight, and nutrients itself. After the seed evolved, gymnosperms became the dominant land plant. The gymnosperms include all the conifers, so think of plants like pines and spruces. Gymnosperms are vascular plants, but they don't produce flowers. They have seeds that are produced in a protective enclosure, usually referred to as a cone. Again, gymnosperms don't have flowers, but they do have cones, which function somewhat similarly. Cones are either male or female. The male cones release pollen. The female cones, which contain the eggs, are usually larger and more protective to protect the new embryos. The sperm gets to the eggs when pollen is carried on the wind. However, wind pollination is very inefficient. Most of the pollen released won't happen to land on a female cone of the same gymnosperm species. So gymnosperms produce massive amounts of pollen, with the hope that some of it gets to the right place. If you've ever shaken a pine branch while that tree is releasing pollen, you may have seen a dense plume of pollen being released. Or maybe you've seen a thick coating of pollen on your car. This is often from gymnosperms. Gymnosperm reproduction does not have the two generations found in bryophytes. Instead, their reproduction is more like ours. The adult plants are diploid, which again means they have two sets of chromosomes. And they produce haploid sex cells, or sperm and eggs. Again, remember that these cones are either male or female. Pollen containing haploid sperm develops in the male cones, and haploid eggs develop in the ovules of female cones. The male cones release pollen, some of which happens to land in the right place to fertilize an egg. Once that egg is fertilized, it develops into a diploid embryo, which can develop into a seed. The seeds are then released, often carried by the wind, and germinate into new diploid plants. The last group of plants to evolve were the flowering plants, known as the angiosperms. Angiosperms are divided into two groups, the monocots and the dicots. There are 5 main anatomical differences between the two groups, the first being in the embryo. Plant embryos have a structure called a cotyledon, which becomes the first leaf of the plant. In monocots, the embryo has 1 cotyledon. In eudicots, it has 2. You can remember this because mono means 1, so monocots only have 1 cotyledon. You can also tell a monocot from a eudicot by looking at the leaves. Picture a leaf from a corn plant. Corn is a monocot, which have leaves with parallel veins. In eudicots, the veins are in a branched position, more like a maple leaf. Monocots and eudicots also differ in the arrangement of their xylem and phloem, the vascular tissue. So you can tell a monocot from a eudicot by cutting a cross-section of the stem and looking at the arrangement of the vascular system. In monocots, the vascular system is scattered in bundles, but in eudicots, it's organized in a neat ring. Flowers can also give you a hint. Monocot flowers have parts in multiples of 3, so they may have 3 or 6 petals. Dicots have flower parts in multiples of 4 or 5. And finally, if you dig up the plant, you can look at its root structure to tell if it's a monocot or a eudicot. Monocots have fibrous roots that branch immediately in all directions. In eudicots, the roots branch off of a large taproot. Pause the video again to answer this question. Despite the fact that they evolved most recently, the majority of plants on Earth are now angiosperms. Again, angiosperms are vascular flowering plants. Their seeds form in an ovule in the flower that is encased in an ovary. And angiosperms are extremely diverse. Here is a pie chart of the number of species for all the major plant groups. You can see that together, the groups we talked about before angiosperms, the bryophytes, ferns, and gymnosperms, only make up less than 10% of all plant species. Almost 90% of plant species are angiosperms. Flowers are where all the reproductive structures are found in angiosperms. The petals and sepals are actually modified leaves. Most angiosperms have both male and female parts together in their flower, but you'll see that some angiosperms have separate male and female flowers, or even separate male and female plants. The male part of the flower is known as the stamen, and usually there are several stamens in a single flower. The stamen is made up of 2 parts. The filament is a stalk that raises the anther, where pollen is produced, up to where it is more likely to come in contact with a pollinator or exposed to the wind. The female part of the flower is known as the carpel. It consists of a few different structures. The stigma is where pollen is received. It's usually sticky to latch onto any pollen that comes in contact with it. To get to the ovule, the sperm in that pollen needs to travel down a stalk called the style to the ovary, which contains the ovules. Pause again to answer this question. As I mentioned, some plants have separate male and female flowers. Corn is an example of this. The tassel on the top of the corn plant is a male flower that produces pollen. It's positioned at the top of the plant to take advantage of the wind to spread its pollen. But the ears form when ovules of the female flowers, which are on the stalk, are fertilized. Some angiosperms even have separate male and female plants. Pawpaws are a small tree found in West Virginia that produce a delicious fruit. They're actually the northernmost mango relative. Pawpaws have male and female trees. So if you want to grow pawpaws to produce fruit, you need to have both male and female plants. Flowers are incredibly diverse, and some you might not even recognize as flowers. Flowers that are pollinated by animals tend to be showy and colorful to attract pollinators. But wind-pollinated plants, like the oak shown on this slide, tend to have small green flowers.